camera. And yet the video effects allow Tharp to surpass Baryshnikov, staying up in the air obviously longer than would be humanly possible, even for that Russian superstar. In this screen dance solo, Tharp recorporealizes herself as Baryshnikov, but she becomes a super Baryshnikov with augmented powers, powers heightened not by the magic so often associated with dance, especially with ballet and its fairy tale themes, but by the down-to-earth, assertively feminist harnessing of science through modern technology, which makes television dance. Perhaps this travesty dance, as one might call it, set to her father's favorite music, in some ways allows Tharp to become her father or her father's favorite son. Perhaps it allows her to become that other father, George Balanchine, in her choreographic creation of a brilliant fusion of ballet and vernacular dancing, vying with his achievements in square dance as well as Agon and other ballets. Perhaps it allows her to finish Agnes de Mille's work by making a cowgirl who truly becomes a cowboy. But other aspects of it make clear that Tharp's competitive eye is really on Baryshnikov. If in Push Comes to Shove, he became Tharp, imitating her floppy, fluid, jazzy wiggles, in this solo, Tharp becomes Baryshnikov. And yet, even as she does so, she adds another layer of gender bending to that recorporealization, mixing male and female, refracting the soft, raggedy movement she gave him in Push through a masculine stance, as if she were quoting Baryshnikov, quoting her. After seeing Once More Frank in this Making Television Dance solo, and even more so if we know Push Comes to Shove, we are led to see Baryshnikov as Tharp, and vice versa, and finally, as a result, to see Tharp as Baryshnikov as Tharp. This multiple layering of genders through intertextuality creates a complex image of androgyny that is in tune with the aspect of 70s feminism that challenged gender stereotypes, with which, of course, Tharp explicitly identifies herself. Rather than creating a 20th century version of travesty dancing in which she becomes a man, by recorporealizing herself as Baryshnikov in this particular way, Tharp enables both men and women to widen the purview of what they may dance and to compete aesthetically. To compete, I mean in the best sense, for excellence on a level playing field. Thank you.
This is like following the Beatles.
You started this whole event. You got to finish it. Our leader, Doug Rosenberg.
Okay. Thank you. The real does not efface itself in favor of the imaginary. It effaces itself in favor of the more real than real, the hyperreal, the truer than true. This is simulation. That's a quote from Baudrillard from Fatal Strategies. As dance for the camera inscribes itself, it effectively ensures that the image inscribed is the one which will endure. It is rare that one goes back into an edited version of a screen choreography and alters it in any way, as one might a work for the theater. The nature of theater dance is that each performance of a work has a unique life of its own. That phenomenon is exceedingly apparent when the dancer and the role changes for any reason. The dance and the choreography are a living, organic being. The mediatized performance, or the one committed to media, inscribed electronically or otherwise, is a permanent record, even as it is a freestanding object. As in Baudrillard's description of the hyperreal, the performance of a choreography for camera does not efface the stage version in favor of the filmed version. It effaces itself in the creation of the truer than true, the performance of a body that cannot and does not exist. The simulation of the dancing body is the logical extension of a genre of work that courses through modernism and settles in places such as futurism, Dada, the happenings, and body art. The act of inscribing an autobiographical corporeal presence is embedded in the modernist ideology of transcendence, though it comes to fruition with the shift to postmodernism and the appropriation of techniques of representation of the self from the conditions of literary biography and the work of Rousseau, Wordsworth, and others like them. In other words, the act of inscribing a quote-unquote dance onto the medium of film or video is the act of constructing an autobiography, or at least a biography. It is a construction of animate and inanimate, organic and non-organic, real and imagined, in short, a hybrid of flesh and technology, not unlike a Frankenstein. The hyperreal choreography for the camera is always referenced by its other, the real performance of a choreography in real or theatrical space, as Frankenstein is referenced by his other, the corporeally correct and accurate man, the man that nature intended. So in a sense, I want to just add something here, and that is that recorporealizing the body via screen dance essentially is taking a body, chopping it up into separate parts, and killing it, to use that Frankenstein metaphor again. And then the challenge is to reanimate it in another medium. Recorporealization is making a work of deceased parts in that analogy. In the videotape Blue Studio, directed by Charles Atlas in 1976-77, we see Cunningham in the studio, on the road, the point of view constantly shifting as Cunningham dances, again in quotes, with dancers videotaped in black and white in another earlier period of time. It is the collision of images and score by John Cage existing in a contingent electronic space that gives the piece both its form and content. And I'm going to show a little bit of that in a moment. The importance of Cunningham's contribution to the development of dance for the camera cannot be overstated. His recognition of the camera as a site for situating choreography and the inherent differences between camera space and theater space has ensured Cunningham a prominent position in the history of the medium. While many choreographers initially create a work of choreography for the stage and later adapt it for the camera, Cunningham has reversed the process in works such as Points in Space, created for the camera and directed by Elliot Kaplan in 1986. According to Kaplan, Cunningham is acutely aware of the contextual differences of camera and stage space and makes precise and numerous adjustments in the choreography for each. And I'd like to screen a little bit of this right now, Blue Studio.
I'm going to kill some time. It's a silly question, but can one kill time?
Like to watch the whole thing. Just as a note, this was broadcast on television when it was made in New York in a television studio. Elliot told me yesterday that Beach Birds, Cage Cunningham, the documentary, has never been broadcast on television. So you can see that things have changed quite a bit since 1976 in terms of the culture. In Beach Birds for Camera, which we screened last night, the 28-minute film choreographed by Merce and directed by Elliot Kaplan, we experienced the choreography first in studio with the changing light of the day contributing to a spare, elegant mise-en-scene, and later in another location without natural light, but set in proximity to a shimmering blue panel. The film moves from a cool, almost ascetic black and white to color, and as it does so, the viewer moves both metaphorically and literally to another site, one with a decidedly different emotional range. The presence of Cage's score, 4 to the third power, at times audible, at times barely so, is embedded in the picture, its source seeming to be the film itself. Beach Birds, as seen in the theater, though striking, is quite different from the film version. In its theater version, the score is performed at a distance from the stage, the effect being a separation of music and movement, two distinctly different sources. Ironically, the dance itself, lacking in the quote-unquote close-ups utilized by Kaplan in the film version, seems flat by comparison. There is no shift in sight or architectural specificity. We are always aware of the theatricality of both the dance itself as well as our relationship to it. The visceral experience created by Kaplan in the film version hovers in the mind like a dream if one has viewed it prior to seeing the work in the theater, and a longing for the presence of those images is inevitable. This experience reinforces the power of cinematic dance and cinematic dance images to replace or serve as a mnemonic marker for the quote-unquote original. In fact, Beach Birds as a cine dance displaces the original or stage version, at least for me. In her book titled Screening the Body, Lisa Cartwright notes that, quote, the motion picture, in conjunction with more familiar 19th century medical recording and viewing instruments and techniques such as the microscope, the X-ray apparatus, was a crucial instrument in the emergence of a distinctly modernist mode of representation in Western scientific and public culture, a mode geared to the temporal and spatial decomposition and reconfiguration of bodies as dynamic fields of action in need of regulation and control. It is a familiar claim in film scholarship that public audiences of the first motion pictures were thrilled by the body in motion. Popular pleasure in the sight of moving bodies was bound up with 19th century development of recording instruments. Cartwright goes on to say, quote, cinematic apparatus can be considered as a cultural technology for the discipline and management of the human body, end quote. Or I would say, for creating the body that never was and can never be. Cartwright states that there are two histories for the cinema. One that begins with an investigation into human movement potential as science, which gives way to the emergence of a popular film culture and a break with science around 1895, and another, which is her field of interest, that of a scientific film culture that lasted well into the 20th century. If the body was, quote, measured, regulated, and reconceptualized in medicine and science, end quote, by the use of cinematic device in the early part of the century, as Cartwright states, then I would propose that the act of creating dance for the camera is in fact the act of creating the virtual body, one not hampered by the rigors of science at all, but instead a cinematic construction of the ideal kinesthetic body, to which gravity and the temporal qualities we ascribe to earthbound, chronologically anchored humans no longer apply. The Judson Dance Theater grew out of an era in which artists, musicians, poets, and others were actively pushing and ultimately breaking down boundaries that separated previously autonomous art forms. Robert Rauschenberg and Robert Morris, both visual artists, were collaborating with dancers and themselves performing in their own work and the work of others. Meredith Monk was performing quote-unquote dances that resembled theater and included the use of film within the theatrical environment and ultimately began making films as freestanding works. Dance itself was beginning to give way to a new and different articulation. In her book, Choreographing Difference, Ann Cooper Albright speaks about the Judson Church Group, and in particular, Yvonne Rainer, and states, quote, the work of Judson Dance Theater in the 60s and that of Grand Union in the 70s, both of which Rainer actively participated in, was concerned with using the body simply as a thing that senses, moves, and responds, rather than as a physicalization of a dramatic persona, end quote. She goes on to quote Sally Baines, who, writing about Rainer's Trio A in Terpsichore and Sneakers, says, quote, The possibility is proposed that dance is neither perfection of technique nor of expression, but quite something else, the presentation of objects in themselves, end quote. In writing further about Trio A, Baines deconstructs the dance as follows, quote, "Three body parts are equally conspicuous as loci of activity: the arms, the whole torso, and the feet. They are often set in motion either simultaneously or in close canon, so that the effect is of three unconnected activities happening in three different parts of the body," end quote. And later, Sally again, "The dancer's gaze is never directed toward the audience. It is directed away from the spectators because of the facing of the body away from front," end quote. Both Baines' description of the dance and her note that dance for Rayner might be about the metamorphosis of dance into objecthood reads like a description of cine dance. The fragmenting of the body into cubist planes of activity and the creation of a solid object from a three-dimensional kinesthetic experience seems to be inadvertently laying the groundwork for a theoretical shift not only from dance to dance, but from dance to screen as well. It is interesting to note that Rayner left the active practice of dance for filmmaking, and her films have retained the spatial quality found in her former practice as well. Baines refers to the dancer's averted gaze as a gaze facing, quote, "away from front," end quote. As dance moves from stage to screen, of course, front as a geographical marker becomes irrelevant. Her description of Rayner's directed effort to break or unlock the gaze between performer and audience is an apt metaphor for describing dance as it embraces the screen and simultaneously objecthood. As we unfix or unlock our eye-to-eye gaze with the performer, we can begin to objectify her, or may begin to. I am not using the term in the pejorative, but rather to describe a relationship like one would have with a sculpture or a painting. As video or film begins a trajectory from documentation tool to screen dance, from passive recorder to active participant, the dance itself, as fixed on tape or film, moves from palimpsest to objecthood. It becomes the thing it is rather than the thing it was. Video or film in its secondary function as documentation is inevitably reportage, a relic of the past. In its primary function, as equal partner in a hybrid work of art, it is both the methodology of fixing the ephemeral body and the body itself, an autonomous object. One of the promises of contemporary technology is a liberation of the body from the corporeal shell. On a very simple level, this promise has been with us for years. First the telegraph, later the telephone, allows us to fragment our holistic self into its disembodied parts. In other words, the body stays in place while the thoughts, words, or voice travel to a distant location. Hence, the receiver of said text is experiencing but one element of the whole and imagining the physicality of the individual sending the voice forth. Cinema reinforced this paradigm with the use of the close-up and asymmetrical framing of the body since its earliest days. And dance, of course, has gravity as its constant earthly reminder that the body is indeed weighty and of this world. The dancer need only to begin a leap, and the reminder becomes quite real as she is pulled back to the earth. And Sally mentioned the piece, Maya's piece with Tali Beatty. And however, as we have seen in cine dance, when Tali Beatty leaps into space under the lens of Maya Deren's camera, he remains aloft for as long as the filmmaker wishes. And we're going to see that film tonight. This exercise in temporal sleight of hand is oversimplified in this analysis, however. What is at work here is what we have described as the recorporealization of the body via screen techniques. Bodies, as we know, are constantly in the process of becoming, of having their life experience literally written or inscribed upon them. But what occurs when the body is the instrument which is inscribing its own image onto film or videotape? And again, citing 9 Variations that we saw last night. In the case of 9 Variations on a Dance Theme, which was shot in 1967 by Hilary Harris, with the dancer Betty DeYoung performing, the body we see on film is a different body than the one Miss DeYoung stretched and moved in real space, and certainly a different one than the body she owns some 30 years later. So the question is then, which is the authentic body? The expected answer might be that the corporeal body, which currently serves Miss DeYoung, is the authentic one, the one which life has been inscribed upon. This argument works because Miss DeYoung is among the living. However, in the case of Tali Beatty, Maya Deren's collaborator, who died a few years ago, where is the authentic body? The cinematic image of Mr. Beatty in Maya Deren's film, A Study in Choreography for Camera, is forever inscribed as a sensual, erotic, and fully formed dancer, very much alive in our collective memory. Camera dance recovers the deceased body, in some case reinvents it and recorporealizes it, objectifying it in the process. Though Harris shot 9 variations in 1967 and the raw footage of Miss de Jong has remained unchanged, save for the possible degrading of the film stock, it is perceivable, if he was still alive, that Harris could re-edit the film almost some 30 years later. That, of course, happens all the time in Hollywood, most recently with the Orson Welles film, The Lady Vanishes. This represents a sort of body modification or cosmetic surgery that mechanical or electronic reproduction allows and in fact encourages. Witness the press photos of movie stars that were taken years ago and remain the culturally inscribed signifier of, for instance, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, or Elvis Presley, long after the corporeal body has aged or ceased to exist. Those images become fetish objects in some cases, icons in others, but in all cases become the authentic body of the individual to those who know them only by their mechanically reproduced images. Hillary Harris shot the footage for 9 variations over some 25 sessions, averaging 2 or 3 hours each over a period of 1 year. The body we see in 9 variations is not the body of Miss de Jong on a particular day in 1967, but a body constructed over the course of a year and a body that was in the process of becoming itself as it was being rendered on film. So the process of becoming, of aging, of maturing is all fixed within 9 variations, though what we ultimately see is a lyrical, kinetic, and highly edited version of a dancing body, an impossible body, if you will. Harris's camera fixes Miss de Jong as an extremely attractive, shapely young woman, often bathed in a diffused light. Here the male gaze renders the female forever young. Her body reveals the choreography as the camera reveals the body. Harris's treatment of the dancing image is much like a sculptor whittles away at a piece of wood, revealing the figure that is hidden inside. It is a decidedly modernist approach to object making that Harris has adopted, one in which the body is the raw material for the finished object, an object which is transformative in its final form. This approach denies any sort of reading that would include issues of agency, ownership, and representation, except as revisionist theory. And to imply any sort of sexism or exploitation would deny that Harris in 1967 was working within a modernist culture. But we can use this work as a model from which to glean the maturation of a cubistic, almost futurist engagement with the body vis-a-vis cine dance, one in which the body is raw material for a reconceptualization of corporeality, in which mechanical reproduction recorporealizes the body, and one in which the filmed, edited body becomes the authentic body as it outlives its subject. And while this methodology privileges the director, it is in a subversive way a technique for authoring one's own autobiography, as well as a reality and self-representation. I screwed that up. And while this methodology privileges the director, it is in a subversive way a technique for authoring one's own autobiography, as well as reality and self-representation are shaped by the dancer's choice of movement vocabulary. I think I dropped a line. Subjecting oneself to a year of shooting and dancing the same phrase over and over has, through mechanical reproduction, ensured Betty de Jong from the effacement which comes with the end of a dancer's dancing life. I'm going to screen a tape here. It's a 3-minute piece called Bruce by Ruth Sergel, directed by Ruth Sergel, and performed by Bruce Jackson. Am I done for time? 7? Good. Can we have the lights down a little bit, please?
For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born,
cut that. Lights, please.
So authoring one's own autobiography or inscribing one's own image or an ephemeral image, that's the potential for me of this medium. If, as Jacques Derrida claims, that inscription itself signifies the displacement of the sign by the following sign, then the act of inscribing the body as movement on film or video is an act in which the preferred result is complete effacement of the original sign in favor of its recorded image. In The Object of Performance, art historian Henry Sayre says, quote, "Inscription acts as a hinge between the already given and the projected," end quote. The already given for the purpose of this discussion, the performance of choreography or simple movement, and the projected being that which is rendered or recorded. The act of inscription, then, is the necessary performance of the work, which is subsequently effaced and superseded by its recorded double. Hence, inscription of a dance requires that the original be usurped by its copy. This paradox is not at all dissimilar from the nature of performance art as it came of age in the 1970s. I'm just going to paraphrase a few things here, but performance de-emphasized the object in favor of other practices. And ironically, as we look back at performance, the thing that we attach to are the images of those ephemeral performances. Thinking back to the early fascination with speed and movement of cinematic experimenters, it is possible to link the practices of artists such as Bruce Nauman to the arc of those who focused on creating new hybrid representations of the body. As early as 1966, Nauman was creating work that tracked the absence of the body, its action as pure residue in the form of plaster or epoxy resin. That is, Nauman was mapping the body by its absence from the frame in works like Space Under My Hand When I Write My Name and Templates of the Left Half of My Body at 10-inch intervals, both in 1966. And Yves Klein's body prints in the 1960s were made with the active participation of his models, though Klein realized that he need not paint from them, but rather he could paint with them. As dance moved out of the familiar context of the theater and the more familiar context of recognizable movement vocabulary in the Judson Church era, it also risked disappearance. When one removes an object from its quote-unquote proper context and asks viewers to find it, the outcome may or may not be what is expected. The oscillation between the progressive movements in the visual arts and those of dance cannot be overstated. Rosalie Goldberg says, quote, that the dancers were leading performance beyond the earlier happenings and their abstract expressionist painterly origins is exemplified by the fact that a sculptor like Robert Morris created performances as an expression of his interest in, quote, the body in motion. As sculpture moved toward minimalism in the 1960s with its attendant philosophy, so did dance. Yvonne Rainer emphasized the object quality of the dancer's body when she said that she wished to use the body, quote, so that it could be handled like an object, picked up and carried, so that objects and bodies could be interchangeable. And again, this reads like a prescriptive for camera-specific dance. Dance critic John Martin uses the term metakinesis to describe the situation in which the viewer is drawn into the dance. He says, quote, because of the inherent contagion of bodily movement, which makes the onlooker feel sympathy in his own musculature, the dancer is able to convey through movement the most intangible emotional experience, end quote. Metakinesis literally outside of the movement. If one applies this concept to dance for the camera, it is also quite accurate. The inherent contagion that Martin describes is what I have similarly described as kinestronic response, which is a combination of kinesthetic and electronic, kinestronic. That is to say that in the mediated image of a dance, the screen version, there remains the trace of Martin's inherent contagion. However, the sympathetic emotional experience he notes is in the mediated dance exacerbated and further articulated by camera techniques, as well as the ability of the makers to frame issues of loss, pain, identity, etc., within a recognizable form, i.e. television. This recognizable form carries with it the expectation of narrative, of intimacy, and to a certain extent of fashion. And what I mean here is that screen dance existing within the arena of television may be expected to be visually fashionable and perhaps topically fashionable as well. And I'm not using the term fashion, again, in a pejorative sense, but rather to describe a condition that is both timely and visually attractive or seductive. The next piece I'm going to screen some of is Bill T. Jones and John Sanborn's Untitled, shot and directed by John Sanborn. This is from, I think, 89, late 80s.
Tent. I was laying and sleeping by myself with maybe 3 other individuals, 2 on one side of me and 1 on the other side of me. And I peeked out the bottom of the flap of the tent, and suddenly in the distance I saw what looked like the inside of a fireplace moving toward me. But there were giant logs, completely burning, one stacked on top of the other, 4 or 5 high. They were being pushed by a bulldozer at tremendous speed, moving toward the tent. The next thing I knew was that I, like a banshee, was whirling throughout this park, throughout flower beds, looking for coverage so that the bulldozer with the burning logs would not get me. I woke up.
You said a system in collapse is a system moving forward. Do you remember Bill Katz? Do you remember Rodessa? Do you remember Seth? Do you remember Nadine? Do you remember Bobby? Do you remember Edith and Lon? Do you remember Judy? Do you remember Maria? Do you remember Lois? Do you remember Lois? Do you remember Nevis? Do you remember Willie? Do you remember? Do you remember Keith? Do you remember Juan? Do you remember Longa? You said a system in collapse is a system moving forward. You said a system in collapse is a system moving forward. You said.
Things seem as usual. Bill and I, it appears to be, are moving into a new apartment. Outside, I see many of the people who are working on the construction surrounding this house. And there's a low brick wall, which has been put up very quickly, but very beautifully, and the beginnings of brick pathways, etc. But as I turn, I see a giant wooden scaffolding piece of material, which is usually laid on the ground, standing upright, but a young workman with his shirt off, very beautiful, is standing there, and suddenly the wooden structure falls and pins him underneath it. I'm probably the farthest distance away from it, from anyone.
Again, I wish we could screen the whole thing here. Lights, please. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and finish up here. Bill T. Jones and John Sanborn's Untitled is both timely and topical and visually seductive. In a sense, the makers use the seductive power of Jones' mediated body to pull the viewer into a place in which Jones is able to speak frankly, openly, and directly. Arnie had died already before this work was made. The most intangible emotional experience Martin notes the dancer is able to convey through metakinesis is made all the more potent in the screen dance with the addition of first-person narrative, the use of the close-up to add intimacy, the sound of the dancer's breath, and editing techniques which allow the makers to cite or acknowledge other people, places, and objects of value to the narrative or text of the work. Herein lies the difference between Martin's idea of metakinesis and my concept of kinestronic response. When Arnie Zane joins Bill T. Jones in the frame in Untitled, it is a duet that never actually took place. In fact, Arnie had been dead for some time before the piece was made. Yet we feel ourselves moved by the electronic presence of Zane all the same. When Bill T. speaks directly to us via the camera, and when his recorporealized body moves through the frame in intimate range of the camera's lens, we feel a kinestronic response. Martin's most intangible emotional experience is in fact inscribed electronically in the medium of video and recoverable at any time. This is what I mean by inscribing the ephemeral image. Finally, there is the concept of loss that pervades discussion of dance and its mediated other. Something is lost in the translation to video or film, is the statement that is most often spoken in that regard. This phenomenon of loss was articulated by Walter Benjamin in his 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Benjamin, in the seminal essay, says, quote, "Even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. The situations into which the product of mechanical reproduction can be brought may not touch the actual work of art, yet the quality of its presence is always depreciated." He goes on to say, "That which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art. One might generalize by saying the technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique experience," end quote. Later on in the article, he says, "Even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be." Benjamin's concept of the aura is important because, in a way, that is what drives us to attempt to reproduce the performing arts, dance, and others, through the optical mediums. It is as if we can, through a sort of alchemy, fix the aura of the thing we point the camera at. And I would propose that it is possible to both recorporealize a kind of fleshy physicality while inscribing that which is, quote unquote, lost, the aura of the work of art, in this medium. Thank you. So I'd like to ask all of the panelists who are here from the last 2 days to come down front to answer questions from the audience, and then we'll also answer questions, and you can fill in these seats. And if you all want to move down too, it would be good. What time are we supposed to be done?
6.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be done at 6. So we have
Okay. Yeah.
25 minutes.
25 minutes. Okay. I want to, again, before we, get frantic about leaving and such, I just want to thank everyone involved in making this event happen, and especially those of you that came to it. Because without you, somebody was using the analogy, Laura, I think earlier, about the circle. The circle is not complete without you all participating in this event. So thank you, and thank Cloud and everybody. I'm too tired to remember everyone's names. So if there's any questions for any of the panelists or any comments you want to make, this might be a good time to continue our discussion over lunch. Pooh K has a question.
Yeah. Hi, Doug, there were a couple of things that you said that I just would like to react to. The first one, can you hear me? The first one was your intimation that dance, if it's not fixed or translated into a media, disappears, or its media image is the image that exists in time. And I would like to contest that on 2 points.
We need to turn that. Can somebody turn?
It's on.
I know
Just
it's on.
hold it close
I have
to
to
your
hold it
mouth.
this way.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
better.
Okay, yeah. I want to contest your point that dance is will not exist in time except in its media, in a translation, in a form, that next to its media representation, it disappears. I'd like to contest that on 2 points. The first one is that I feel very strongly that dance, the physicality of dance is transferred through the body and through contact, both physical, visual, and personal, and that its existence through time is a constant transmutation of gesture, of the language of dance that's carried on through generations. I mean, even looking at these films, I mean, I can look at them and I can see the ghosts of other people and other images drifting through the movement that's being executed. And I don't think that's not something that is dependent on any kind of fixing in time. That's actually an organic human function. And I think that's the essential nature of dance. The other thing is that the memory of seeing a dance concert, for instance, stands up against the memory of that dance on film, but it looks different. Like, after you said that, I went through my catalog of Merce Cunningham movies and Merce Cunningham dances after you made your comment about Beach Birds. And for me, it was just a different visceral memory. My memory of a dance performance is much more fragmented. It's about what my eyes were framing or absorbing at the moment that I was seeing it, whereas my memory of a film tends to be more of a picture, an entire composition. I just wanted to comment. That's all.
I think, and you know, these are just my opinions, but I think the first part of your comment about, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but I think that you were maybe you were making that comment on something that I didn't exactly say, and I don't remember the question well enough. But I wasn't saying that dance, you know, that a mediated image of dance is better, or you know, or somehow replaces. But I think I was talking more about the fact that it displaces the live version. And the thing that you're referring to is the thing that Benjamin calls the aura. I mean, that's why I was using that example also. That live event that you described is certainly not replaceable, and is never the same for anyone else on any other night, given the same body of work.
I wasn't specifically talking about an event. I was talking about the actual material of dance, which is the physicality and the space that it inhabits. And I was saying that truly exists in the passage of that material from teacher to student, from mentor to
Right.
protege, whatever,
Right.
or even just on the streets. It transforms and it just extends out into the world. And in some way, that's a much more insidious and absolute.
Right. I think that's dance. That is dance as. I think that the difference is in modifying it by the dance and a dance. I mean, I think that they're vastly different. A dance is what I was referring to, not the dance.
Maybe if I could
Yeah.
intervene, I think maybe, because I agree with you, Pooh, that there's a kind of myth that dance is by nature evanescent and that it disappears, and I would argue with that and say, in many ways, it has a real permanence through kind of equivalent to oral tradition, but maybe the distinction is between a performance and a dance, because you know, certain versions of certain dances do not disappear because they stay in the repertory and people keep learning them, and as you say, it's passed on from generation to generation. But one particular performance that you see may not get repeated again. So in that sense, it's not permanent.
Right, but in the case of someone, a soloist who doesn't set their work on anyone else, who only makes work on their own body, who disappears from this earth, where does the dance go? Where does the dance go? Okay, I'm just going to play the devil's advocate and say, you know, it lives in memory.
Well, it does, though. You know,
Okay.
there's someone.
someplace in the 1940s, I saw Martha Graham do Immediate Tragedy. And I remember very little of the dance, but the thought of it is so vital and so electrifying that at this moment, I could feel and remember the tears that came to my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether any reproduction of what she did could ever do anything like that, I don't know. And you mentioned this word aura, and I think it's that Benjamin raises, which is as relevant as anything. That's all. So when you talk about dying, you can't say it dies. That's not death.
I don't disagree. Any questions for anybody else?
Actually, I was going to make a comment on that, actually, what Daniel just said. Yeah, because I have the microphone again. Anyway, talking about how you were saying that this piece that you saw live made you cry, and if something, if it was redone, it probably would bring the same emotions. Well, going to Bill T. Jones' Untitled, every time I see it, it makes me cry because it brings back a memory of my own. And I've never seen it live. I don't think it's ever been done live. So that piece to me is very strong in that way.
Just an interesting, just a little thing, that there was a night when something happened down at ADF and they couldn't do a certain piece, and Bill T. had to do something at the last minute, and what he did was a version of the videotape live, which it had never been done live, you're right, and he reversed that process and mimicked the tape. Star?
Oh, well, I was just going to mention, I think it's important maybe, I don't know if this is going to make any sense because I'm really, my brain's so scrambled from everything I've heard. I don't even know if what I'm thinking makes sense. But I think there should be a distinction between whether a dance can be recreated and whether the experience of seeing the dance is recreated. You know what I mean? I mean, I know like my day job of documenting Donald's work, that stuff can probably be recreated because I feel, I shoot most of his performances and I shoot in rehearsals and I shoot so much stuff that if they looked at all of it, they could probably figure it out. But the elusive thing of capturing the experience of sitting in the show is a whole different thing, and I wouldn't want, I would try, I mean, you would have to do it completely differently. You couldn't, it's not about all the steps and stuff.
Yeah, but it's not about recreating. And I forget the word that, what did you use? Translating?
Well, I think...
That was a different thing.
Well, okay, let me put it this way. I don't mean, recreating is such a hard, difficult word. I mean, if I'm working from a dance that exists on stage, put it that way, making something that communicates on screen what I feel like I got sitting in the audience, and that can be a whole totally separate thing. You just looking at me like, what the hell is she talking about?
No, it's not you. It's me.
Thanks. I wonder if this isn't a false argument, because I understand what Douglas is saying. He's not disagreeing with you at all. I think what he's saying is that, see if I'm right, that what we just saw is something else. Right?
Yeah.
It is.
It's
I
a
mean,
complete
it's when you say,
construction.
it's a totally new thing, and it's not competing with the original dance. It's not a reproduction of the original dance, really. It's not trying to evoke the aura of the original dance. It is its own thing. Its own work of art. It is the original, but it is the original that you have made. I mean, that the filmmaker and the choreographer together have made. And I guess I want to, I'm going back to this old article of Erwin Panofsky's that I really love called Style and Medium in the Motion Picture. And also back to something that Noah was talking about in this notion of the moving picture, that the moving picture is not a picture of something, it is its own entity. And I'm not talking about modernist purity here. You know, when Michelangelo used a model for the David, let's say, he's using the model of the model that's sitting in front of him in one way. But the product that he's coming up with is not meant to be a reproduction of that model. He's using the model as a help, as an aid in the creation. And that's not exactly what you're doing in film either. But I guess the point is that it is a work of art in and of itself. That uses material from the outside, that uses the moving body, whatever it is. But once it's on the screen, it's no longer a body, it's a moving picture. There's nothing you can do about that. That's what it is. It's light projected onto a screen and what you're looking at. I think that's the trap we're all falling into. The trap we're falling out is that we think we're seeing Bill T. Jones up there. No, we're not. We're seeing how many frames going along. That's exactly what we're seeing. And that's a totally different thing than Bill T. Jones. Does that make sense?
All right, here we go. Move that mic around.
I'm just going to, I got the mic just real quickly. I thought you were talking about the experience of the body, both the kind of thing, the object, and then the viewer's experience of the object, which are, and that's how I'm interpreting that also, because sometimes the memory of our experience of something, and what kind of practice are we involved in, what kind of bodies are we having, which gives body to the thing that we're seeing. Because I feel like in 100 years, somebody who hasn't had any kind of training, we all still have had some kind of training that puts our body with his body when we see it on screen. But in 100 years, that will be dead. I mean, using this kind of dead thing, which anyway.
I was going to say something about energy, but it feels like shouldn't we get up and like move around or something? But it sounds like the common link between all these things, representations or originals or copies of originals or whatever, is energy. And the energy is what transfers, translates, transmits along with no matter what media I think that we find ourselves watching. And it lives on. So I made a note about the tape, Bruce, that you showed, which, you know, he's certainly authoring his own biography, I think is what you said. But he's doing it in a really powerful way in terms of energy. And there are themes of dignity and integrity that definitely come through. And we can qualify that, because it would have been a bit more tragic if those themes perhaps weren't as powerfully portrayed. So, and it's, you know, I kind of, to tie Ellen's presentation back as well, it seems, you know, that that act of actually performing that piece for a camera was probably one of the greatest things that he could have done to illustrate his struggle to overcome the moment of death or the moment of erasing one's life and preserving this kind of wonderful spiritual energy that he's managed to kind of harbor within his body. And that's what I think, you know, back to Kandinsky's theory of art is when the viewer, when we watch something, there is this potential resonance of artistic molecules that can take place in our bodies. And so when we watch something that is quite profound like that, you know, I think it happens. So, I don't know, I'm probably rambling on a bit. But anyway, something, if maybe, do you have a brain to comment on that?
Me?
On energy, actually. Doug, is there anything left? But I was just curious because it feels like that's a nice link that avoids, and I actually agree. I think this is sort of a non-argument in a sense, or a non-problem in a way. But
you said everything. There's nothing left for me to say. I mean, I think you framed it.
I think, well, I guess I'm having a little bit of difficulty in comprehending what you've said. And I'm not a scholar and primarily a soloist performer. And so I guess on the comments, particularly about what happens with the soloists in their work when they die, that the dance dies, when that performer or that artist goes and leaves this planet. I just very strongly disagree with that, whether you're a soloist or whether you work with other human beings, and that when those that have choreographed and have done the artistry of the work, those that have experienced it, whether it be in a video or a film shoot, we all experience something at the moment of when we are collaborating with those artists as they are kind enough to share their work and put it into another form. So what we experience is different than what the audience would be experience when they see it in a two-dimensional format. So I'm just having a little bit of difficulty in understanding what you're saying about how dance dies when people die. And my my first question to you is, I don't really quite understand if you could explain to me your meaning of authentic body, as in your paper, how you used it.
Well, I'll start with that one first because it's easier. It was actually posed more as a question than an answer, but the example was 9 variations on a dance theme, in which was shot over a year. So the body that we see in that film is not one body. It's a body that has matured and aged over that period of time. And Betty Jiang now is, I don't know how old she is, but she possesses a different body than the one that we see in that film. So it's just a sort of open-ended question about which body then is the one that we, which one is which one is the authentic one? I mean, the one that I know is the one in 9 variations on a theme. So to me, that's the authentic body. That's the only body I know.
Well, then could you just plainly explain to me your definition of authentic body?
I think that it is the one that is inscribed upon the receiver, whoever that receiver might be. I mean, I think other people have a different authentic body of Betty Dijon than I do. The one that I have is that one. I have this authentic body of Ellen. I mean, I think it depends on the receiver of the information. I think it's a shifting thing.
But the giver of information, that's, I guess, the giver of that information seems to be left out a lot in what you've been describing, is the giver. So that's just a comment, a concern I have about those people that do give their artistry.
Somebody else.
I'm just sort of trying to figure out what this conversation is all about, because I'm really tired, and you know, sometimes, Doug, I just have no idea where you're going, and have to work so hard to figure out what you're saying. But that's good, because it makes me think. But I feel, and I don't know if I'm right, but in my tiredness, I feel like there's something missing from the conversation, and maybe, maybe not, but maybe it's the word time. Like, the word time is missing from the conversation.
Timed?
Time, T-I-M-E. Like, I feel like you're talking about time in a way, and memory, and, you know, I remember you as a little girl, but I've never met you before, and time takes that away from you. But because I have not seen you anymore, I keep that time in my head, and time is the thing that kills dance, and it's the thing that influences dying, but time does not affect that because it stays the same. So
Yeah.
there's a sort of, sorry? Well, ideally, I mean, that's the idea, that we watch 9 Variations on a Dance and it's the same. Yes, I know we change, but it is the same.